and you were part of birthing that baby.
I came in after the idea had originated. Mark
a midwife, so to speak.
Yeah, Mark and Wendy did the.
Explosion.
And hello and welcome to episode 7 of Buds with Suds. I'm Richard Zombeck, and in this episode, I interview Jimmy Billings. He is a recovery coach supervisor, an instructor at North Shore Community College, and the occasional Santa Claus. In the interest of full disclosure, I did work with Jimmy at Project Cope and now Bridgewell, answering calls in the ED at Lynn Hospital on 24-hour call. And Jimmy and I have a lot to talk about, so let's get to the interview. Okay, Jim Billings, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Little prelude here to the show. This is our second round. We tried doing this yesterday and got to the end of the hour, and I got home and took a look at the recording, and there was none. So Jim has been gracious enough to grant me a second interview, the first of which will never be heard, and hopefully it'll be as good as yesterday's because, to be honest with you, I really enjoyed it. So Jim is... He's a recovery coach supervisor with Bridgewell, formerly Project Cope. They were one of the first organizations around here to be answering calls in the emergency room at Lynn Hospital. He is also a trainer at North Shore Community College for the recovery coach certification, and was a recovery coach and is a recovery coach himself. And also, what was your degree?
Oh, I went to North Shore Community College and I got drug and alcohol counseling. Okay. It's a certificate program, but it took a couple of years to do.
Okay. So as I was thinking about this last night, what was also kind of, you don't have a lot of opportunities to revisit an interview and realize that you forgot to ask some things and to say some things. So hopefully this will be an opportunity for both of us to address some things that maybe we didn't think about or had the hindsight to think about that we should have talked about. So first things first, you were one of the first recovery coaches to go into the hospitals in this area on the North Shore. At the time, the organization was Project Cope. I had an interview with Mark Kennard, who was at the time the executive director of the program. And my understanding is that he and Wendy Kent, who is now the head of the program here, is that correct?
Yes.
Had gone down to Rhode Island to see a similar organization that was doing the same thing, and then came back and over the course of a year developed a program here in Lynn. Absolutely, yes. And you were part of birthing that baby.
I came in after the idea had originated. Mark
a midwife, so to speak.
Yeah, Mark and Wendy did the initial legwork, and then I came on board right at the time that they probably needed me when it was going to be finally installed. It was a couple months after I got hired that we started the program.
So I'm kind of curious what that looked like and what some of the hurdles were, particularly with the with the hospital staff, with the people who are working there who had already been in the trenches trying to address this for several years, and the frustration that went along with that.
It was interesting. When I first got there, you ran into some nurses in particular and some doctors that were very, what I like to say, hard on certain patients. Their repeated overdoses kind of made the nurses and the doctors, what I say, hard, in that they didn't want to go out of their way to treat them anymore. They were certainly treating them, but their willingness to treat them had kind of become non-existent. So that when the recovery coaches came in and we're all gung-ho and excited to introduce this new philosophy of meeting people where they're at and suggesting better alternatives and so forth, at first it wasn't necessarily met wonderfully, but it didn't take long for the staff to realize, wow, these recovery coaches are really filling the void. They are meeting with the individual where they're at, and they're basically calming them down. They're having one-on-one conversations. They're finding out a little history that maybe the nurses don't have time to do. So now it was a complete reversal. It was like, wow, the recovery coaches are coming in and taking my place as far as finding out what's challenging this individual and so forth, so that hopefully the recidivism would go down, and I'd like to think that it has.
And so you guys get a call, right? And right at the time, because I was working with you guys as well, that was actually my first experience in the recovery quote unquote field. There I go with air quotes again on a podcast. Never very effective. And I don't know where I was going with this. We would get a call. We'd have a 24-hour shift. At some point during that shift, a call would come in. I think the response time was 20 to 30 minutes. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And we would go to the hospital. It was primarily opioids, overdoses. So usually when you say meeting someone where they're at in this case is they've just been Narcaned.
Right.
And they're not too happy about the buzzkill.
Right.
And
you took the highway,
Right. And in some cases they're in withdrawal.
Right.
So, I mean, one of the challenges that I found was one, or at least I thought it was going to be a challenge when I started, was having a conversation with anyone at all in that condition. And two, what I found difficult in a lot of cases was convincing people to stay long enough to make sure that they weren't going to overdose again, right? Meaning that once the Narcan wears off, there could be enough opioids in your system for you to overdose, right? Which is generally 2 to 3 hours.
Right.
And usually when someone's jonesing, they want to get the hell out of there and fix that.
It's not unusual for them to AMA, leave without medical assistance.
Right. So how do you address that challenge, or do you?
You use the right word. It's a challenge.
Yeah.
So I accept challenges. I've accepted challenges all my life.
You hired me.
That's true. Good point. I had the pleasure of I still have the pleasure of working with Jean Jones, and Jean Jones thought she's the in charge of the nurses at Lynn.
She's
Union.
wonderful.
And she's a wonderful lady. And she asked if I would speak to the staff, and I have a tendency to be highly unusual in my approaches and stuff. And
as do I.
And I brought an 8x10 picture with me that I passed around to the staff, and it just happened to be a picture of Santa Claus. And then they wanted me to talk about particular individuals that I've dealt with. So I went into a little bit of a spiel about a man that had drank for 30 years and that he had been to all kinds of detoxes and never got the message. And lo and behold, with a second drunk driving offense, he was able to get recovery. And at the end of my presentation, I explained to the people that the picture I passed around was me.
So you ruined my last question for this podcast.
And the second part of that was the person that I was talking about was me.
Right.
So that I was able to hopefully put away some of the stigma that the people had about their idea of what an alcoholic is. Who would have thought that someone like me that drank for 30 years would be working in a field helping people to try to get recovery?
You have a very nice approach. My approach when I met with the nurses was slightly more abrasive, as you might imagine. I had one of the nurses say to me, "So just because they're one of yours and you're with them, we're supposed to treat them special?" And I looked at her and I said, "I'm going to assume that you treat everyone with dignity and compassion. So no, you don't need to treat my people any more special than anyone else.
Any different,
right? Any different at all, right?" I find a lot of the issues surrounding some of the problems and some of the pushback that the medical community has with this, particularly in the ED. I would say 50% of that is because they've experienced it personally in their life.
Absolutely.
They have a child or they have a family member who's suffering, who can't stay sober, who can't get sober, who may have died, who may be in jail, which tells me that this problem is, it reaches deep into our communities. I always kind of quote one of my sponsors, my first sponsor, and he's not the only person who said this, obviously, but alcoholics come from Yale and jail, right? Park Place and Park Bench, and people don't realize that.
Right.
I think they're realizing it more because it's hitting more affluent communities, and up until now, it's been ignored. The fact that we can be on Facebook talking about being in recovery, the fact that I can have a podcast and openly say that I have a substance use disorder, that I'm an alcoholic, is amazing.
It's truly amazing. I mean, who would have thought that I would have the opportunity to sit down with the governor of Massachusetts and talk about the opioid crisis one-on-one, and then have a news presentation where $50 million was going to be sent to the health organizations throughout the state to battle the opioid crisis. We've talked about this before. The Surgeon General of the United States, it says that every American should carry Narcan. I mean, that says we have a crisis and that we can't bury it under the rug. We have to talk about it. You were talking about there's a lovely woman that I met in the health field that at first she wasn't receptive to the idea of recovery coaches at all, and she was somewhat negative. And what was cool was I had an opportunity to sit with her one-on-one, and finally found out that she's raising a 10-year-old boy that's her grandson because his father is in jail because of the opioids.
So why the pushback on recovery coaches then, on her part?
On her part, it's almost like there was anger towards her son. You know what I mean? So she carried that anger to every...
So screw him, he can't be helped?
Well, somewhat to the extent. Yeah. Because that idea existed. And what we had to do is change that idea, and that... an addict and an alcoholic is a person that you just hit the nail on the head, Yale and jail. There's a lot of tremendous people that have an addiction or a disease that's not their fault, but it's got to be treated.
The mayor of Boston.
Absolutely.
Marty Walsh is an alcoholic.
Absolutely.
And he talks about it.
Right.
He won't allow safe injection sites in the state, but, he talks about it.
But he's a human being. He can make a stand on whatever it is he wants to make a stand on.
I know.
And the other thing I clarify...
I have some feelings about that in case you didn't guess.
The other thing that I clarify is that I'm very careful to call someone an alcoholic or an addict. Right. I call myself a person in long-term recovery, because I don't want that stigma to go out there that when I say my name is Jimmy and I'm an alcoholic, that all of a sudden someone's idea of who I am is based upon the word alcoholic. So I try to change that within the system is changing, that people with addiction that have starting to come out on the other side are in recovery, a person in recovery.
So that you refer to yourself as a person in recovery?
The only time I refer to myself as an alcoholic and my name is Jimmy is at an AA meeting. But when I speak to people, I'm a person in long-term recovery.
So so the usual positive spin, words matter, yada yada yada.
Well, you never know if you're going to lose. You're going to lose somebody in the group. If I'm there to speak to someone, I should clarify that. When I go to Middleton Jail and I speak to the men and women in the detox, I introduce myself as an alcoholic and my name is Jimmy, because I feel like that's a forum where people are being incarcerated and medically cleared to go before a judge after 30 days and determine do they want help or don't they want help. So I'm there to kind of give them a message.
So that's interesting, and that may be a topic for a whole other conversation. I find that this happens a lot when I interview people.
Right.
But I generally find that I will refer to myself as an alcoholic, and I've also referred to myself as a person in long-term recovery. But in a group, for example, when I use the term alcoholic, I find that I go into a definition of what that means for me.
Sure.
Right. Of what that it's not just about drinking booze, that alcoholism is a much deeper issue, particularly the way that I've come to understand it. Right? Sobriety, the same thing. Right? In fact, we had a roundtable discussion on what's today? Today's the 14th. Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day. I have my red on. Where's yours?
You do. You do. I actually forgot that it was Valentine's Day. On the 12th of February, we had a roundtable discussion that we got into kind of a discussion about sobriety and what sober means, right? Because it means different things to a lot of different people, right? And one of the guys brought up that, if I'm drinking or smoking PCP on the weekend, am I still sober if I say I am, right? And that gets into a really murky kind of area, right?
Well, the Recovery Coach Academy covers that. They determine, they say, they ask the question, when is a person in recovery? And the answer to that question is when they say they are.
Right, exactly.
So if a person says to me that I've been in recovery for a year, and then we get to talking and I realize that they're on the marijuana maintenance program, in their mind, they're not using opioids and they're not using alcohol, and those are the two triggers that they have. So as far as they're concerned, they're in recovery.
Right.
How am I to say they're not?
Right, but I think the conversation that we had was, but are they sober?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And again, that's the same thing, right? It's the same kind of squishy definition about things that we tend to have of like someone can say they're sober and someone can say they're an alcoholic and come to AA because it's all self-diagnosed, right?
I made the mistake of mentioning at a meeting one time that I had popped a pill to get into an MRI machine. It was my third attempt to get into an MRI machine, and I just flat out couldn't get into the machine without some kind of calming influence. And as I said before, I'm an alcoholic. So I didn't even know what kind of pill the doctor gave me. I just took a pill that it was supposed to relax. And my group told me that I had to give up my 2 years sobriety because I used mind or mood altering substance.
So that little noise you hear is Jimmy tapping the table. So I just chastised him publicly on national radio.
I'm not touching the screws like I was yesterday.
The three people that are actually listening to this will now know what that means. So let's go back to the ED, the ER. I always have a hard time calling it the ED for obvious reasons because it means something different, particularly to men. Right. But the emergency room, the visits there. So you guys have, over the course of the last 2.5 years, managed to come up with some pretty impressive numbers.
Yeah, Wendy Kent, who's just an amazing individual that supervises me and supervises the program. She's very meticulous and very data oriented. And even I was amazed when she said that when it comes to numbers, we're able to make some kind of contact or some kind of introduction to 70% of the people that we meet in the ED or the ER.
So how does that work? I'm trying to kind of parse out where that 70% gets applied. So is it on the initial visit, or does it come with a follow-up? What's the progression from the time you guys get a phone call?
Right. When we get a phone call, I think back, it seems like yesterday, my first call, and I'm going through my head what I'm going to say to this person. What words of wisdom am I going to instill upon this person to make them stop using whatever drug they're on? And I got there, and the person was pretty much comatose, and there was no response whatsoever. When you meet someone where they're at and they've overdosed and they've even been Narcan and they've been brought back to so that their respiratory system is now working, it's not collapsing, they're still out of it. So 30% of the people that we get called to go see, we don't necessarily talk to. So when I say we make a connection to 70%, we actually talk to 70% of the people, whether it be positive, whether it be negative, whether we just leave literature, whether if we just leave an idea in their head. Yes, we do follow-up calls.
So you're saying 70% of the people that come to the ER with an overdose, you guys have contacted?
Yes.
initially.
Yes.
Right. And so the other 30% is what? Either they've left or they don't.
Some have the misfortune of dying.
Right.
Some, as I say, are at a point that they're still, how do I want to put it, incoherent or whatever terminology you want to use. It's just not feasible to talk to them. There's a young lady that I cried when I went to go see her, and she was on a hallucinogen, and she was very small and thin, and she was being a contortionist with her body, and she's yelling and screaming and making no sense whatsoever. And so that would be an example of somebody that I couldn't connect with because they were having hallucinations.
Yeah, so. Obviously a bad trip too.
Right.
So you guys are primarily doing opioids.
Opioids.
Do you answer calls for other substances?
Absolutely.
Alcohol, benzos.
One of the first times I was there, I had seen 3 straight people that had overdosed in one call, and then there was a person that I could tell seemed to be under the influence of alcohol to the degree that they were coming out of it. And I asked the nurse what the situation was, and she said that he was repeatedly came in for alcoholism, so I spent some time with him. And actually I connected with that fella, and I haven't talked to him in the last couple of months, but it was 8 months that he had in sobriety after that first visit that I had him.
Nice.
Or saw him, I should say.
Nice. So I'm gonna kind of try to explain this for the listeners at least, and I'm not even going to ask you to correct me if I'm wrong because I know you will. But an overdose is essentially the receptors in your brain that control your breathing stop. Mm-hmm. They stop communicating with each other, and that's what an overdose is. Is that basically your brain stops telling your lungs to work?
Yes, the overdose, the medication, whether it be fentanyl, whether it be heroin, goes, what I give as an example is I point to the top of my head, and that all the drugs have centralized at the top of my head, and they're telling the brain, telling the body systems to shut down one by one. And the first one they start with is the respiratory. And when Narcan comes into the picture, it takes those meds that are at the top of it,
back up,
the meds that are at the top of your head pot like the Red Sea and come down on the sides, and now you can start breathing again.
Okay, all right. So I wasn't.
That's the simplest example.
So I wasn't. I wasn't that far off.
No.
So of the 70%, this is we're going to get into a little bit of math here. Of the 70, because you guys also do follow-up calls, right? So
Absolutely.
every single person. So we were talking to, not on the show, but as part of my job, we were talking to the ED responders at Gosnold on the Cape, and they're looking at numbers like 100% of the people that go into the ED are contacted. So what I'm assuming that means is that the follow-up calls. So those follow-up calls to the 70%, they outreach to 100%. I'm not saying they contact 100%. Let me correct that. Okay. They outreach back out to 100% of the people that had presented in the ED with an overdose or that had gotten a call.
Right.
And I know you guys do follow-up calls. So what does that kind of look like?
Well, the interesting thing on follow-up calls is there's an element of trust when it comes to addicts and alcoholics. And when you just overdosed and you ended up in the emergency room, you're fearful that the police are going to be contacted and so forth and so on. So when I ask someone, can I do a follow-up call and would you give me a number? There's an amazing amount of phone calls that I make that isn't the accurate number because they don't want to be followed up, but they don't want to say, no, don't call me.
Well, you know what I used to do? I used to go, do you mind if I call you right now?
Right.
Let's see. Let's see. Right. Let's make sure I have the right phone number.
It's interesting. I've done the same thing.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting, the follow-up calls. What Salem does, which is amazing, is they have a lieutenant on the police force that does door knocks. He doesn't go out in his police uniform. He goes out with one of the people that works at Healthy Streets, Mary Wheeler's program, and they instead of calling, they go right to the house and knock on the door and check on the person. So
How's that going?
I haven't heard any negative results of it. I mean, I'm sure it's sort of like the telephone. You do a door knock, someone comes to the door, I'm here to follow up and find out about so-and-so. Oh, well, they're doing fine, and the door shuts. So I don't think that you really get a whole lot of negativity other than the door might shut.
So let's go back to the calls. So now you guys have, what is it, 7 or 8 recovery coaches working right now?
Right.
And in the beginning, it was a 24-hour shift. You guys have changed to an 8-hour shift.
8-hour shift.
Do you find that to be more manageable?
Oh, yes.
And for scheduling too? Or?
Scheduling is great, and it's also, especially for those of us that have been here since the beginning, they used to do 24. It's nothing to pick up someone's shift to cover for them and do 24 hours.
Yeah, 24.
Because you were used to it anyway.
24 was rough. And,
yeah.
I don't really remember getting any calls at like 3 in the afternoon.
I always think of Barry, one of my recovery coaches. I walked him through the orientation at Lynn, and I said, now, Barry, it's Thursday night or Wednesday night, and you won't get any early morning calls because it's notoriously slow at that particular night. And of course, he got a call at 3, 4, and 5 in the morning.
That's when I got all my calls. You had mentioned your first call going in, and that kind of that rush and that concern and the doubt. And I had the exact same thing. I mean, I remember sitting at home just checking my phone constantly to make sure it rang. And then driving, and how long a 20 or 30 minute drive can be when you're in your head the whole time. I mean, I had things going on in my head. It's like, what if I don't care about people who overdose?
Right.
What if I'm strictly just biased towards alcoholics? What if I find out I'm a racist? Right. I mean, that's how far my thinking went, right?
Absolutely.
And I go in, and this is the first guy. He's Hispanic. He's lying in the hallway. They called him a frequent flyer. He'd overdosed on fentanyl, and I went over and talked to him. And I was kind of like, how's it going? He's like, yeah, I overdosed. I'm like, well, you want to tell me about it? And he started crying. He had overdosed in his mother's bathroom. And his mother was a senior citizen in housing. And I remember having talked to someone before this, and them saying, you don't have to think about anything. You're going to know exactly what to do when you get there, right? And so I looked at the guy, and I just went, you overdosed in your mother's bathroom? He goes, yeah. I go, that's brilliant. And he looks at me like, what are you talking about? I'm like, anyone else would have stolen your dope and left you there to die.
That's right.
And he started laughing. And I go, so what do you think? You want to try detox? And he goes, yeah.
You never know how you're going to make a connection with someone.
I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that. And ever since then, I've just found, you and I yesterday had talked about, and I'd like to revisit that because I think it's relevant. We do this work. Well, this is I'm interviewing you. We'll talk about you. I'll interject my own stuff later, maybe. But
I'm sure you will.
You too. I could do the whole thing standing on my head. You do this work, and the medical community and people in security that I know and other members of the hospital look at us like we're either crazy or care too much, overly compassionate, or empathetic, or whatever. I don't really see it that way. But the question is always, how can you do this? How do you do this? So, Jimmy, how do you do this?
On my road to recovery, I drank for 30 years. And when my alcoholism took me to my bottom, I was living in a facility that I thought alcoholics went to die. I was living in a rooming house above a bar in Salem. And can't get too much lower than that, other than the fact that I got behind the wheel of a car and got a second drunk driving offense. And the amazing part of my journey to where I'm at now is the number of people that understood and talked to me and made a difference. And what's amazing is I might have heard the same thing from 10 different people, but it wasn't until I met the 10th one that it hit home. So when I say meeting somebody where they're at, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, hey, there's a person in front of you right now that thoroughly understands what you're going through, and you don't have to live this way anymore.
Do you think it's making a difference?
Yes. It's too early to throw out the data that we've collected, but I've noticed in the last 2 months a decrease in the number of calls that we're getting to the ED.
Well, there are statistics in Massachusetts right now that I think the overdose deaths have gone down by about 4%.
Right.
The rate of overdoses has, however, increased of people overdosing, but people dying of overdoses has been reduced significantly. In fact, oddly enough, that was on WBOR on NPR, and I was listening to it as I was driving home after I'd screwed up the first interview, the first interview we did, and I was thinking to myself, wow, when I listen to this, it's going to be a shame that I wasn't able to have those statistics on hand.
Right.
And so here we, good fortune, right?
Right.
And
the number of overdoses, as far as them going up, what I've found is when I first started doing this, there was an amazing number of people that had overdosed 3, 4, 5, 6 times. And now what we're finding is that person isn't happening as much anymore. That I would like to think that the majority of those people have either gotten to treatment or they've died. And that the numbers that we have now are people that are first-timers type of thing, one-shot type of deal, But even for that person, it's an eye-opening experience, and you have an opportunity to present the information that they need to figure out if they're addicted to this particular drug or whatever it is, so that they can really do an assessment as to what they want to do.
Yeah, I was thinking when you were talking about, how do you do it? And for me, I know this is going to sound, I know you'll probably agree with me, but I think it's going to sound strange to listeners who aren't themselves in recovery, or it might not. I don't know. Who am I to judge? I find that the people that make up this segment of the population, to use a generalized term, are some of the most sensitive, compassionate, kind, smart, and generally good-natured people. Mm-hmm. So I don't have issues with that, And it's funny because I was the first recovery coach at where I work, and one month within a 15-day period, 2 weeks, I had gotten something like 24 referrals, and both my boss and the doctor that I work with were like, we're kind of afraid that you're getting a little overwhelmed. And I was like, what are you talking about? I could talk with these people all day. Mm-hmm. It's the rest of you that are driving me nuts. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's like
the normal people,
quote unquote, right?
Right.
At least I'm dealing with people who know what's wrong with them,
right?
Or
right.
At least know that something's wrong with them,
mm-hmm.
and I can start a conversation there,
mm-hmm.
right? And it's that level of being willing to listen, right? And I don't want to say desperate, but it is. Mm-hmm. It's a low level form of desperation, mm-hmm. but it's knowing it's that. So a lot of people that I talk to will say, they'll talk about spiritual awakenings, right? And that you have to have a spiritual awakening, right? Well, to a degree, and I'm going to tell you why I agree with that, because the moment that the idea pops into your head that there's another way to do this, the moment that you realize that you can't continue to do what you've been doing, is in effect a spiritual awakening.
Right.
It's that simple, mm-hmm. right? It's not Jesus Christ himself coming down and sitting on your bed and going, it's going to be okay, Richard. It's, I can't do this anymore, and I need help. And you ask for help. Right. So I don't know if it's desperation. I don't know if it's, I think there comes a point in almost everyone who comes into recovery there comes a point when you're more afraid of continuing than you are of stopping. And
Right.
and that's the point that we hope to be at when we reach them, right? Of going, maybe there's another way, right? I can't tell you how many times I answered that call to the ER, and my first sentence after saying hello and introducing myself was, "You want to try something different?"
Right. Yep. Or how can I help you? I mean, the other thing that I found, and I made mention of it in, sorry, it was yesterday, the idea that when you meet someone and they're on a hospital bed and they've reached a point in their life that they've lost their family, they've lost their housing, they've lost different things, they have a story to tell, and nobody wants to hear the story.
Right.
So as a recovery coach, I'm willing to sit there and listen to every person's story, because by sitting there and listening to a person's story, you can make a connection on how to help them on a road to recovery.
Yeah, and plus those stories are interesting as hell.
Absolutely. And then, I mean, case in point, it's very rare that I use my own story when I'm dealing with a client, because I found that I haven't had the need to. I might elaborate on a point that a person says that I can identify with. But one of the things I've learned in Alcoholics Anonymous is that they promise that if you work the program that you'll be amazed at what happens. Well, I don't mind saying that I got into recovery because I love my children to death. And I tell people that I went into recovery for my children. Well, I happen to have a daughter that lives in London, England, that hasn't talked to her father in a long time. I passed out in front of her when she was 16 years old. So I could dwell on that. I could, apologize as many times as a person can apologize, or I could do what I'm doing and help another alcoholic and an addict with the idea that hopefully my daughter will get the message that I'm a different person.
Well, and you said you don't share your own story, so I'll share a little bit of mine with you right now, because you just never know, right? When this show goes up, which will be in a couple of weeks from when we're recording it, I'll be in Switzerland visiting my daughter, who up until last September I hadn't seen in 12 years.
Amazing.
And I just was 12 years sober in January. And so that's something that I can tell you, is that you never know and you never give up. Mm-hmm. And however that manifests itself, that you're going to be okay. Mm-hmm. Right. And I knew that because someone else told me that. Mm-hmm. Right. It's like, it's going to happen when it happens, if it happens, right. And it might not. And you don't need to prepare for that. I'm not giving you any advice. I'm telling you the suggestions that were given to me was that you continue to do what you're doing for yourself, and you watch how life unfolds, right? And one of the things that I tell the people that, not in the hospital when they've just been Narcaned or things like that, but after I've developed a little bit of a relationship with them, is, and I'm really not afraid to say this, and I don't know why, but I do make one promise, and my promise is, only from what I've experienced, was that if you stay sober, you will learn to live at peace with yourself.
Absolutely.
And I know that from my own experience. Mm-hmm. I know that from watching other people. Mm-hmm. There is no doubt that there are people that have decades of sobriety that are miserable. Mm-hmm. And
we don't do this not to be happy. I mean, no one decides to get into recovery and figure, okay, I have a death sentence that I have to go to all these meetings and I can never be happy. I can never do things that I used to do. In my case, I thought I could never go golfing again, because golfing to me was throwing a 12-pack in the back of the cart and going out and playing 9 holes. But the reality of the program and the reality of figuring out that you have a disease that's not your fault and doing something about it, you do get amazing gifts. I might have not crossed a bridge yet with my daughter, but I really didn't have anything to do with my mother for 30 years of drinking.
Right.
And now for the last 13 years, I have a relationship with my mother that's phenomenal.
I call mine every day, and we were at war for 15 years.
Absolutely. She's 92 years old, and actually she gave me one of the best lines that I could give to the fellows when I go and speak to them in detox. She told me that the only time she ever got a good night's sleep when I was active was when I was in a program. And so I tell the fellows at jail that if they really think about it, there's probably one person outside of the jail that loves them that's getting a good night's sleep for 30 days.
Yeah. Yeah. My mother actually, I was in class with Barry, your recovery coach, and during that class, he leaned over to my boss and to me and called me an a-hole. And I relayed that to my mother, and she asked me to thank him.
I love it. I love it. My first experience in AA, I had lost my license, second drunk driving offense. I had a fellow that ran a painting business, and he offered to give me a ride home. And he asked where I was living. I said, I'm actually staying with my mom. I'm 48 years old. And so I figured he was just going to drop me off. And I said, thank you, and shut the door. And the next thing you know, he was following me in. And I said, what are you doing? I have to tell your mother what AA is all about. I never asked the man. I never expected it. That's just a gift that you get when you realize that you're a human being and that other people are human beings, and we have to relate.
Yeah, I had a really good friend of mine. We were kind of talking about stuff one day, and it was one of those times that, you're just talking about life, and people are cooking, and we're getting ready to, have dinner and stuff, and some idiot brings up, what's this all about, and why are we here, and decides to go down that road.
Right.
You'd think we were all stoned having that conversation.
Right.
But, and this friend of mine, he's in the kitchen, he just turns around, he goes, we're here for each other.
Right.
And I was like, wow.
My 92-year-old mother says she's getting to an age that, Jim, why am I still here? I said, Ma, I need you.
Yeah, that's good.
You
That's
know?
sweet. Yeah. Yeah. So I want to go back to the reason we're here. Not that that's not a terrific conversation. But so you guys also have a facility that offers therapy and addictions counseling and stuff like that. So going back to one of the questions, which was once you've seen them in the hospital, you have their number, you can hopefully reach them. You reach back out again. What does that look like? More so on the ones that actually give you a legitimate phone number, and what is your rate of retention, engagement? Not to sound overly professional or clinical, but what does that look like as far as people being engaged and coming into any form of recovery?
Well, let's put it this way. School's still out as far as having the actual data. Again, my supervisor, Wendy Kent, is wonderful at documenting everything, and I'm sure in a couple more years we could give you accurate data as to who we met in the ED, who we followed up a call with, who signed up for therapy, who signed up to work with a recovery coach, who went to an IOP, who went to a program, so forth and so on. At this point, if I had to guess, ruling out the people that give fictitious phone numbers, but the people that I actually talk to, I would like to think that it's somewhere around 45 to 50% of the people that have more than just a visit at their bedside.
Have sought some kind of aftercare.
I've taken them to their first NA meeting. I've taken them to their first SMART recovery meeting. I've taken them to their first NA meeting. I've introduced the idea of meditation to them. I have a fellow that just did a video for our Bridgewell gala. They wanted someone that was successful that I've dealt with over the last 3 years. And this gentleman had been in jail, and I met him in jail, and he went back to jail even after I met him, but he kept on pushing. And he just recently passed the first part of the Recovery Coach Academy. He was in his housing unit that we had gotten through Bridgewell, and he heard a commotion outside, and it turns out someone had overdosed and no one had Narcan. Well, he had Narcan, and he saved the woman's life. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, this is what I'm dealing with on a regular basis, and it's how you present yourself. It's almost like what you say. I had one fella, I walked into the room and he just flat out said, "Look, I know who you are. You're a recovery coach. You can't help me with anything." Okay, no problem. I said, "But listen, I am going to say this much. I have a card, and you'll remember it because it has a motorcycle on it, and that's how I take care of my mentality is with going for a motorcycle ride. But I left the gentleman my card, and I said, I'm willing to bet that there's someone in your immediate family that could use my help." And I left.
That was good.
15 minutes down the road, my phone rang, and it was the fella asking if I could come back and talk to him.
Nicely done,
You
my friend.
never know
Nice.
when someone's going to get the message.
Nicely done. I have that happen quite a bit too. Is I'll leave voicemail after voicemail after voicemail. We'll do 3. Sometimes if whoever referred them pushes me a little bit, I'll do maybe another one. And then they go in the pile. And I've had 6 months, 7 months down the road said, "Hey, you left me a voicemail." It's like, yeah, that was 6 months ago.
Right. But hey, I just got a phone call the other day from a fella that's back. He's been on the run for a while. He got the program for a little bit. I figured I'd never hear from him again. He's never forgotten me.
On the run or on a run?
On a run,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
And he's never forgot. He's always picked up the phone, whether it's 6 months after being on a run. "Hey, Jimmy, do you remember me?" "Of course I remember you. What can I do for you?" You can never give up on anybody. Never give up on anybody.
So listen, speaking of appointments with people and stuff, you have one coming up. So we're going to need to wrap this up a little bit. And again, thank you so much for doing this again. This has been great. I have 2 questions I want to get to, just really quickly. You are also a recovery coach trainer at North Shore Community College. There have been 1,150, I think is the number from the RISE report, 1,150 people who have gone through the recovery coach training. 70 people have received their CARC. And there have been almost 270 people who have taken the recovery coach supervision training. Any thoughts on those numbers?
The amazing thing about recovery, to me, is that no matter what helps you to recovery, at some point you realize you didn't do this by yourself, that a hand was extended, someone touched a nerve. And what I'm finding is people in early recovery, now when I say early recovery, less than 2 years in recovery, in order to I want to make sure I clarify this the right way, function properly as a recovery coach, I maintain that, and as does Wendy when we interview people, that the idea that they have 5 or 6 years in recovery is what's necessary to have a basis to do this program. What I've found is everybody's heart's in the right place. They want to go out and be like me after 2 years of recovery, become the president of AA and fix everybody, or become a counselor and fix everybody. But what you really find out is you need some time under your belt to educate yourself, to understand yourself, to understand whether or not your heart will be broken, whether or not you'll let a client or a person that you come across do the work themselves rather than you do the work for them.
And you've had personal experience with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, or
as far as
when
myself?
when you were a
yes,
counselor?
I had 2 years under my belt, and I had been to school. I got a certificate program in drug and alcohol counseling. As I just said, I was going to become the president of AA, and I was going to fix everybody. And I had got a job as a case manager in Lynn at a facility that we named Great Hill. It's across from Women's Inc. And I was trying to take care of myself, so I went to a meeting. I remember the meeting like it was yesterday. And lo and behold, I'm walking out of the meeting, and I'm walking towards the Buchanan Bar. And the next thing you know, I'm sitting in the Buchanan Bar. And I'm back to drinking for another year. So that when I came back to the halls of AA, I came in completely stupid. I came in, all that education that I had learned about drugs and alcohol, I had to realize those people that I thought were opinionated and didn't know what they were talking about that had 10, 15, 20, 25 years, I started to listen to them. And it all started to make sense. So I took a good 9 years before I got back into this profession. I met with Mark Kennard and said, I'd really like to do something with that degree. And Mark says, Jim, say no more. I want you to interview for this job. And the rest is history.
Yeah, Mark's a terrific guy.
Yeah.
So we have 5 minutes, which is in speaking time a lot more time than you think. So I want to ask you. This is a question that has come up on the Recovery Coach Commission. It's a question that Charlie Baker has asked when he's looking at the licensure and possible certification above and beyond the CARC, the CARC. And it's a question that I've wrestled with, or I haven't wrestled with it. I have what I think is a pretty good answer to this, but I'd like to hear yours. And so what Governor Baker, one of his questions is how is a recovery coach different than a sponsor?
Okay, you put me on a spot for a minute.
Okay,
no, but what I do understand about the question, and I want to answer you, is a recovery coach. Part of what we do is part of what a sponsor does. So what we're the person that takes the roadmap and suggests different avenues to go. And one of the avenues that I have people go is to a sponsor. Find a person that has a number of years sobriety that you can relate to, that you can talk to, because granted, you're talking to me, I'm a recovery coach, but you need a partner through this. And so a sponsor is someone that hopefully will be there lifelong while you're going through your recovery process.
So that's an extremely interesting answer, and I like it. Because I think the question is asked in a way of why should we be funding recovery coaches when there are sponsors out there? That's at least the way I take it when it's coming from someone in politics. Right? And the answer that's often given is that a sponsor is uniquely a 12-step person that's there to help you through the steps. And I don't agree with that. Because I had a sponsor that didn't take me through the steps or have me read the big book or highlight things. He taught me about my quote-unquote disease. And I think your answer aligns, which is probably why I like it, because it aligns with mine, and I'm going to add to it, is I think a recovery coach, first of all, let's take a look at this. Right? Recovery coaches were there because sponsors were there before us.
Absolutely.
Because peer support was there before us, whether it was Native Americans, whether it was whatever people want to say, right? So I think as far as legislation goes and as far as licensure goes, the answer is there's very little difference, right? Is that basically sponsors gave birth to the recovery coach movement, and that's why there's some popularity around it. What makes me more effective as a recovery coach is, one, I'm paid for it. I'm valued in a way that most people that do this aren't, not me particularly, but our role. And because we work for an organization, and this is the important part, because we work for an organization, we have the full support and resources of that organization available to us.
Absolutely.
Right? So in my case, I can contact a doctor within the healthcare system. I can contact an NP. I can contact a therapist. I can contact a social worker, someone that knows more than me about a particular issue. So if I meet someone in the hospital and they've overdosed and they're willing to talk to me and they need food assistance, they need housing assistance, they need educational assistance, I have 16 social workers that I can call and go, this person needs some help with stuff that I'm wholly unqualified to do.
Yeah, we're in effect, the recovery coach is a guide. We're guiding someone through recovery.
Exactly.
And before our time runs out, I know yesterday I ended with the same thing, and I'm going to do it again this time. I had the pleasure of interviewing you a while back, and you're an interesting character. You came across, there was something about you that struck a nerve with me. I wanted to hire you immediately. the rationale behind
You
it
regretted it just as quickly.
Well, it's funny. You and I have been able to banter back and forth and everything, but from the bottom of my heart, I always knew that you were going to do well once you grabbed a hold of the whole idea of recovery coaching with the background that you have and the intelligence that you have, and even to the extent of doing this podcast and to have a website, Recovery Binder, which has a little humor to it because you were asked to write a binder in today's world. But it does my heart good to be sitting in the same room with you. I'm doing what I'm doing, you're doing what you're doing, and I just knew that you were going to be successful, and I can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you, Jimmy, and it's unfortunate that this was recorded this time. I have one last question that I ask everyone. Is there anything that you wish I had asked you that I didn't?
At this particular point, no, especially after 2 hours of being in a room with you. I think that we hit almost every topic that I think we could have hit on. But I'll tell you, there'll be time in the future to talk again.
I would love to talk to you again. I'd love to do this again, and maybe you can join us for a roundtable one of these days.
Sounds terrific.
All right, Jimmy Billings, thank you very much.
Thank you.